This is Hear Me Out. I'm Celeste Headley. The Fourth Estate is under attack in this country in more ways than one. The obvious and loudest attack comes from the leading Republican candidate for president, who's called for journalists to be literally killed, and his base has been pretty receptive to it. There's also the constant problem of paying for good journalism, when ads, sponsored content, subscriptions, paywalls, and pledge drives are all pretty unpopular with the public. But there's something else going on here. Big newsrooms are being scooped up and led by people and companies who don't know anything about journalism. Take the Washington Post, which is now owned by Jeff Bezos and led by a Brit with ties to Rupert Murdoch. News, and especially local news, is a key part of a thriving democracy. So if you have to choose between a soon-to-be trillionaire businessman and a foreign editor who's trying to smother stories about himself, does anybody really win?
People really rave about Bezos as a leader at Amazon. His allies to this day will point to his leadership skills to say, this is what puts him in a league of his own. I just don't think he applied those lessons to the Post the way that he should have.
Journalist Brian Stelter joins Hear Me Out in just a moment. Stay with us.
This is the moment.
The Bachelorette is back. And the power
I'm gonna fall in love.
is in Jen's hands.
And I'm gonna do it my way.
ABC tonight.
Everything about her is great.
I feel so special.
Jen's looking like a queen.
My men are very, very hot.
Someone call 911. You are looking so fired.
This is the beginning of a new era.
The Bachelorette season premiere tonight, 8/7 Central on ABC and stream on Hulu.
Welcome back to Hear Me Out. I'm Celeste Headley. There are a few newspapers that occupy a special place in our nation's history and in our hearts, right? The New York Times, the Boston Globe, subject to the movie Spotlight, and the Washington Post. The Washington Post's first printing was on December 6th, 1877. It was a 4-page paper printed right on Pennsylvania Avenue with a circulation of 10,000 and a cost of 3 cents a copy. Joseph Pulitzer wrote for the Post in the early years, as did Teddy Roosevelt reporting from the West. John Philip Sousa, then leading the Marine Band, wrote a march for the Post in 1889. The paper is famous for the Pentagon Papers, for the Watergate scandal exposed by 2 Post reporters, and, of course, so much more. But more than 100 years later, the paper is not what it used to be. It's now owned by Jeff Bezos and operated by a Brit who's driven out talent and apparently tried to suppress stories. Facing a crisis of confidence and an even more dire financial emergency, is the best way forward to get Jeff Bezos more involved? Our guest is the author and journalist Brian Stelter, who just wrote an in-depth piece on the Post's leadership debacle for The Atlantic. Good to see you, Brian.
Great to see you too. Thanks.
So for those who don't know you, tell us what you do.
I remember you and I talked on the radio a long time ago. I think I was at the New York Times back then.
And I was at the Takeaway, yeah.
Yes. After the Times, I was at CNN for almost a decade covering media. And now I am enjoying the freedom to write for lots of different places. So as you said, this piece was for The Atlantic. It's the longest big magazine style piece I've ever tried to do. And I wanted to do it because the Washington Post is so important. It is so valuable. It is a unique American institution, but it's fallen on really hard times.
Okay, so the opinion you bring to us today, which is probably counterintuitive for many people listening, is you think Jeff Bezos needs to be more hands-on with the newspaper. Bearing in mind that Bezos is not a journalist, he's a retailer and businessman. Is that fair?
He is.
Yeah.
Yes. He does not know a lot about journalism, and that is part of the problem. I went into this thinking that the story was mostly about Fred Ryan, who was the former publisher and CEO of the Post, and now William Lewis, who's the new CEO and publisher of the Post. But as I interviewed dozens of Post staffers, editors, reporters, executives, people like that, I came to realize that the real story was about the owner. It was about Jeff Bezos, who has been really an absentee landlord of the Post. Now, you might say to that, great, it's good for the Post to have autonomy, to be free from the owner's preferences, and that's true to some degree. I remember when Bezos first acquired the Post in 2013, the big fear, the big concern was that he was going to meddle in the newsroom, that he was going to put his thumb on the scale, that he was going to make sure that the Post didn't write critical stories of Amazon, or critical stories about Bezos. And that has not happened. He has not interfered at all in the newsroom, which is a wonderful thing for the journalists there. But he's also failed to intervene on the business side, which has really needed his help.
So can we start? We're going to go a little bit more into why you think that he should be more involved in business. But one of the things that you point out in your piece is that he's kind of hired people that he thought would do well and then dumped them into leading the Post and then walked away. And there's a problem with that, for any business owner. But, his choices to lead the Post are now part of this British invasion of American journalism, right? There's actually an op-ed in the Post from Eric Wemple saying Brits are dominating American journalism and British journalism. And he lists off an incredible... I mean, I hadn't even put all this together, how many Brits. I mean, of course, we've long known about Tina Brown, Anna Wintour, of course, but we have Lewis at the Post. Mark Thompson is the CEO of CNN. Emma Tucker is at the Wall Street Journal. John Micklethwaite at Bloomberg. Keith Poole at the New York Post. Joanna Coles at the Daily Beast. All British. And then Eric goes on to say, now let me give you the list of U.S. journalists who are leading brand name British outlets. And there is no list.
Right.
I mean, for me, there's a couple issues here. That's not just his hands-off approach when it comes to business, but for me, the big problem is who he's picking.
That is the big problem that lots of Post employees have as well. They don't understand why, out of a great, deep, pool of talent, Bezos chose this man, William Lewis, who is now very much the embattled CEO and publisher of the Post. For people who have not been following this, Lewis is accused of all sorts of wrongdoing relating to his time in the United Kingdom, working for Rupert Murdoch's newspapers. Lewis has denied this wrongdoing, but basically, in summary, he stands accused of either knowing that stories were based on hacked documents or looking the other way, sometimes maybe assigning those stories. And then when he was charged with cleaning up the phone hacking scandal at Rupert Murdoch's papers, he is accused of overseeing the deletion of records. And there's now a lawsuit where he's not individually named, but where his name comes up a lot in relation to the destruction of records. So there's this ongoing dispute about what Lewis did or didn't do. And the newsroom has very much lost faith in him because he's avoided answering questions. He's insulted an NPR reporter who was reporting on this subject. So there's this whole controversy enveloping him. And Post employees are looking around saying, is this guy really the best we can do? Is this the best we can get? And yes, he does happen to be a part of this so-called British invasion of talent that's been running American media companies.
So since this is a show that's all about opinions, I have to ask for your personal opinion on this. The NPR reporter that he insulted is, a friend of mine, David Folkenflik, very reputable, credible, long-standing journalist with a long history of great reporting.
Yes.
So, I take umbrage, but what I don't think personally this is a good thing. What about you?
Yeah, he called Folkenflik an activist, not a reporter.
Yeah.
An activist, not a journalist. Now, Folkenflik is a straight shooter. If he's an activist, then all of us are activists.
Yes.
So that insult was taken very personally in the Post newsroom. Lewis said he regretted it. He said he wouldn't say it again. But he doesn't seem to understand where his staff is coming from, and neither does Bezos. I think that's the wider point. He just doesn't seem to be in line or in tune with his own newsroom. And so to answer your question, what's my opinion? I don't think there's anything wrong with recruiting talent from the UK or other countries. I'm a big fan of Mark Thompson, for example, who's now at CNN. There's a lot of talent out there. But you have to make sure that these people who come in, wherever they're coming from, whoever they are, that they understand the place they're working at. Because newsrooms are living, breathing organisms. They're really just collections of people who want to be led. And if the people lose trust in the leader, the whole thing falls apart.
So, yes, and we're going to talk more about the business, which is what your long piece, which I highly recommend. goes into. But I got to, just before we take a break, I've got to stay with this idea of Brit executives leading like really tentpole news organizations. And I think especially something like the Washington Post, which is so, because it's always been in DC, that was even its tagline for so long. It's so important to American history. There's so much, there's a lot of places in your piece where you quote people who say they don't know, this person doesn't know the Post. They don't know this history, right? And that to me is sort of the problem with bringing someone in, and you and I both know British journalism is very different. Like the laws about journalism are very different in the UK. The presence of tabloids makes it a very, very different scene. And so, the first thing is maybe they need to get somebody who really understands the importance of the Washington Post to especially American political history.
And that's why Will Lewis's intent, which was to bring in a British editor, Rob Winnett, from his former with the Telegraph, was even more of a scandal inside the Post. Because people were saying, why does this American brand, the Washington Post, known for its American political coverage, need this British news editor to come in and blow it apart? And ultimately, Winnett decided not to come. There was a reversal there. I think that was probably the right move in order to restore some peace and calm relatively inside the Washington Post. It does. It does all come back to this issue of whether the organism can reject or accept the transplant. And these are a bunch of transplants, literally, into these news organizations. I do think, though, there are caricatures of British editors also that I want to be sensitive about. Yes, there are differing standards in British journalism, but there's not that doesn't mean those standards are always lower across the board. It means there's more of a wide range of standards, right? But
to bring it back to your central position, which is that Bezos should be more involved. For me, this question of putting the wrong people, repeatedly putting the wrong person in charge of the Post, argues against him being more involved, right? Like maybe his judgment isn't that great.
He has had a checkered track record when it comes to recruiting talent for the Post. That's definitely fair. I mentioned Fred Ryan, who was the first CEO, Will Lewis, the current CEO, and he was also instrumental in hiring Sally Busby, who was a longtime editor at the Associated Press, who came in to take over the Post newsroom 3 years ago. Sally Busby, although well-liked in the newsroom, people said she lacked vision and lacked the leadership skills that were necessary to lead the Post newsroom, and so she was out as of about a month ago. So these are 3 Bezos hires where he hasn't necessarily gotten it right. A lot of people think he's gotten it wrong, but I think that actually points toward what Bezos needs to do differently. I think he needs to be more involved. I think he needs to learn more about the thing he owns and be more involved in helping his hires succeed, as opposed to just picking them and then running off onto his yacht, which I'm sure is lovely, right? If you had a $500 million yacht, you'd probably spend a lot of time on it as well. But when you own a treasure like the Washington Post, you need to supervise it. You need to know what's going on. You need to set it up for as much success as possible. And when it comes to Bezos, that would have meant being more involved in the business side, being more present in the DC headquarters, and again, not to interfere with the content, but to help innovate on the business strategy.
Okay, this is very interesting to me that I see this as a chance for Bezos to lean out. You see it as a chance for him to lean in. So we're going to continue this conversation in just a moment. We'll take a quick break. I'm Celeste Headley talking to Brian Stelter about the Washington Post and Jeff Bezos. We'll continue this conversation in just a moment. This is Hear Me Out.
This podcast is brought to you by America's Freight Railroads. Nearly everything you care about was on a train at some point. From the equipment they use to record and broadcast this podcast to the tech you use to listen. It's why we invest about $23 billion back into our network every year, all to remain the safest and most fuel-efficient way to move your most important stuff across the country. Learn more at aar.org/railroad101.
In 1978, gay people in California faced a dire threat. Proposition 6, the Briggs Initiative.
The teaching profession is riddled with the homosexual element.
John Briggs is going to fire every gay and lesbian school teacher in the state of California.
I'm Christina Cauterucci. This season on Slow Burn, we'll explore how a nationwide backlash against gays and lesbians led to a massive showdown in California.
This was tens of thousands of pissed off gay guys and lesbians roaring down Market Street.
With so much at stake, young people became activists.
We've got to fight back. We can't let this happen in California.
And activists became leaders.
My name is Harvey Milk, and I'm here to recruit you.
Slow Burn, Season 9, Gays Against Briggs. Listen to the whole season now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. I'm Celeste Headley. This is Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate. And today we have Brian Stelter with us, who wrote a really in-depth piece on the troubles at the Washington Post. And Brian's opinion is that at this point, Jeff Bezos needs to get more involved, more hands-on. So just before the break, you were saying that he needs to learn more about the Post, understand how it works, and therefore he would make better hiring decisions in the future. Here's the thing, though. You know, he doesn't know anything about journalism, and to a certain extent, it's such a temptation when business people come into a news organization and think that they can run it like a business. And that doesn't work. We have seen that again and again and again. In fact, you know, the involvement of investment firms in the news business has been one of the main reasons we're losing local journalism all around the country. So, you know, maybe he needs to really step away, let the people at the Post hire the person to run the Post, rather than getting himself more involved and being tempted to try to run the Post like he runs Amazon.
You know, it's remarkable. People really rave about Bezos as a leader at Amazon. You know, of course, now there's a different CEO, but, you know, Bezos was the instrumental guy. He was the inventor. He was the genius. He came up with the everything store. And, you know, his allies to this day will point to his leadership skills and his lessons from Amazon to say, you know, this is what puts him in a league of his own. I just don't think he applied those lessons to the Post the way that he should have. You know, when he first took over the paper, he did tinker. He had fun figuring out what color button is best for the subscribe button. And he had fun trying to make pages load faster. He was really into page load times, which makes sense given where he's coming from Amazon. He was convinced that the Post needed to figure out how to create a digital bundle. You know, think about a newspaper in print. It's a bundle. It's a bunch of different topics and sections, crosswords and weather and puzzles and ads. And he said, we need to figure out a version of this on the internet. And he was right about that. But then I don't think he checked in often enough to make sure the Post was doing it, making enough progress. He wasn't giving the inspirational speeches about coming up with a digital bundle that needed to be given. And what happened 10 years later is that the New York Times came up with that digital bundle with Wordle and Wirecutter and The Athletic and Cooking. And the Post is way in the dust.
I mean, I think one of the arguments that you make really convincingly to me is this fact that the Post kind of missed its opportunity, that they got so many new subscribers during the Trump years, and they were doing really fantastic journalism. And they could have seized that opportunity the way the New York Times did. But I wonder what specific insights you think Jeff Bezos could bring to the Post that he learned at Amazon. And by that I mean, you can't do the same things at the Post that he did at Amazon to make Amazon profitable. Things like all the anti-competitive business practices, that doesn't translate into journalism. Things like the infamous one-click patent, that doesn't translate into journalism. The accusations of counterfeit, plagiarized products is probably a better way to describe it, where he's taking something that somebody else produces, puts it under the Amazon brand, and then uses the algorithms in the website to drive traffic to their copy product.
Right.
I guess he could do the same. There have been accusations of tax dodging. I guess he could bring some creative tax things to Amazon, but, many of the practices that made Amazon so successful absolutely can't work for a news organization.
I agree with you, although I think I like Amazon more than you do as a consumer. Everything you said is legitimate, of course. And thank goodness for the journalists that scrutinize Amazon every day, like for the beat reporters, including at the Washington Post, who try to hold Amazon accountable because it is this massive nation state. It is this massive part of our lives. I think where Bezos needed to be more present at the Post is perhaps less with bringing Amazon-esque practices and ideas and more with bringing inspiration and support and just the, honestly, presence. I maybe this is going to fall flat with you, but let me try it. I worked at CNN for years during the Trump years where it was really important to know who the boss was, meaning who's the head of the network, who's the owner, and do they have your back? And I was very lucky that CNN did have my back in the Trump years, that CNN was owned by AT&T, a wireless phone company, not necessarily the first company you think of when you picture the First Amendment freedoms, but I knew from the CEO and the board on down that they were not messing with CNN. In fact, they were defending CNN from Trump's attacks. That's true at lots of other news outlets as well. It's really important what tone the boss, the owner, sets from the top. And with Bezos, just really wasn't setting much of one at all after that initial period where he was tinkering and playing around the edges. I think what I heard over and over again from reporters is that on the rare occasions when he would visit or on the rare occasions when he would have a meal or a coffee with a reporter, they came away so impressed. They were wowed. He was so charming, so funny, so smart, asking all the right questions, having all the best ideas, but he was giving so little time. He was doing that so infrequently that, as I said, he felt like an absentee landlord and was not coming through and providing the kind of regular presence and leadership that was needed. And so I guess that's where I think he could have brought more and now should bring more attention. And there is, by the way, one very specific Amazon-style approach that Bezos is trying at the Post now. And I'm fascinated to see if this works. Years ago, decades ago at this point, Amazon set up something called Lab 126, which was this skunkworks operation, this secretive lab in Silicon Valley, hundreds of miles from Amazon headquarters in Washington State. And the idea for Lab 126 was to develop new products, new innovations. This is where something like Alexa ultimately comes from, or the Echo. This is where really important Amazon technology was developed, but it was often its own world, its skunkworks laboratory. And that's kind of what the Post is doing now. Bezos has talked about this new so-called third newsroom, which is the Post says it's creating. They're going to create a new third newsroom where they can develop social media content, lifestyle programming, and try to develop news for people that don't trust the news today. And I think what he's really trying to do is create a laboratory, just like he had at Amazon, to develop new forms of news. That, to me, is really exciting, and we'll see if it works.
I think that's not a bad idea. Skunkworks, for people who don't know it, I think it came from Lockheed Martin originally. It's sort of a department that has a lot of autonomy. They're supposed to be freed. They're supposed to be the innovators, so they're sort of freed from the...
Oh, I didn't know that. You're right. It did come from Lockheed Martin.
Oh, did it?
I'm just doing a little Googling and learning that now.
Look how fast of a Googler you are. They're supposed to be, free of bureaucracy and red tape so they can really get some new ideas out. Okay.
Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work, but I think that is
it's an interesting
rare
idea.
Example
I agree.
of him applying Amazon techniques. But I think overall it's not about taking Amazon practices and applying them to the Post. It's taking his own presence, like his physicality, for lack of a better word, his brain, and applying it to the Post newsroom.
I mean, I feel like I buy that. I think it is really important for executives to stay out of the frickin' newsroom, but also to show that they do have the backs of their own reporters, that they trust.
Yeah, that they care.
That they trust their reporters to do the job they've been hired to do. Let's broaden this out a little bit, though, to talk about sort of, you mentioned in the piece that one of the reasons Bezos bought the Washington Post was partly to prove that he could fix this thing that nobody else could fix, right? That he could fix the funding model for news. And A, pretty arrogant. B, I feel like I could fix the funding for news.
Oh,
I mean,
tell us.
Now, granted, I've worked my whole life for nonprofit news organizations, either NPR or PBS. Granted. But at the same point, I feel like the major CEOs are way too dismissive of charging people per article. Like if they had the same sort of subscription service where that's just set up the pay platform that maybe included, a bunch of different newspapers, I'm not going to subscribe to the Poughkeepsie Press. But at some point, something important might happen in Poughkeepsie, and I want to read those articles, and that could be a huge boon for the Poughkeepsie Press, where they suddenly get a whole bunch of, purchases of particular articles. And it wouldn't send people searching all over for ways to read an article without subscribing. Like, I can't subscribe to all these different publications. I can't. Now, I live in D.C., I subscribe to WAPO. But if there were a way for me to pay, just like with a movie, to rent that movie and pay for that one view, I feel like people would do it. And
this is sometimes known as micropayments.
Exactly.
Yes.
And that could you could have both models. You could either be a subscriber and get all those extras that you talk about in your piece. I could upgrade my membership to get Wordle and cooking, et cetera, or I could be someone who's like, I can't have the subscription, but every once in a while I want to read something out of Playboy, right? Because they actually do have good articles. Right? So like, I feel as though oftentimes when you're approaching news in this sort of big profit generating margin, and I will say, and I say this because a lot of the newspapers that have gone under were profitable. They just weren't as profitable as the shareholders wanted
them to be, right.
Yes. Do you buy it?
And that is actually where Bezos is a strong owner, because he has said, I don't want this to be super profitable. I just want it to break even or maybe make a little bit of money. He's not in it to make $50 million a year because he doesn't need that $50 million. So in that way, he is still an ideal owner for the Post, but he also doesn't want it to lose $50 million a year the way it's going to today. So one of the things the Post is trying is this idea of micropayments. Now, they don't call it that. They don't like that term anymore because that term's been widely mocked in the news industry for the past decade or so. Some outlets have tried it and it hasn't really worked for various reasons. Here's why I'm more bullish on it today, though. And here's why I think the Post is more bullish on it today. People have, as you said, they have subscription fatigue. They're tired of paying these deep, pretty big sums of money for these big bundles. They want different options. And so the Post is leaning into that idea and saying, we're going to provide flexible, frictionless payments so you can just buy an article or two. And I think that has a decent chance of working. I recently had an experience where I was in Iowa in the fall. I wanted to read one single article on the Des Moines Register website. And so I paid $1, to get the entire bundle. It was some crazy low price of $1 for 6 months. And of course, 6 months later, they start charging me $20, $30, $40 a month, right? They do the typical switcheroo on you. I have to call the Des Moines Register. I have to call the customer service desk. I have to hassle them to cancel my account, because these newspaper owners don't make it easy to cancel. They try to rip people off in this way. And it ends up leaving a bad taste in your mouth. It ends up making you bitter, not just about the Des Moines Register, but about the whole damn industry. So I do think that this idea of smaller payments, the ability to pay for an article, it may have a new life now. Bezos had said 10 years ago when he bought the Post, he said, people won't pay for an article, but they'll pay for a bundle. And I think he was right back then. But it's possible that the world has changed enough and there's enough subscription fatigue now that people will start to pay in new ways for news.
Okay, we have to take another little break, but there's still more to be said about this, so stay with us. This is Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate. I'm Celeste Headlee, talking today to Brian Stelter. We will be right back. And we're back. Hello, I'm Celeste Headlee. Today, our guest is Brian Stelter, who says the solution for the Washington Post might be more Bezos. That's something on which I'm not sure I agree with you, Brian, but there's plenty of things of common ground here. I mean, I feel like we found some threads here that we can both agree on. let me see if I can make it more combative now. But because I want to broaden it out to journalism in general.
Yeah.
I have, especially this election season, been really flogging that horse on getting rid of horse race journalism, changing the way we report on politics. Part of that is driven by something which I think really affects the Washington Post, which is so associated with Washington and politics, which is that Americans in general really don't trust the news media anymore. And there's also a ton of research showing that when journalistic outlets focus on the strategy of a campaign, when they start to treat it like a game, which the Washington Post absolutely does, people tend to think that outlet is of lower quality and they avoid it. They sometimes click on stuff because, Trump might win is going to scare every Democrat. Biden will get reelected is going to scare every Republican. That fear will drive the click, but they say it's lower quality. What do you think of this idea that perhaps the problems of the Washington Post are deeper and wider? Like if the things that are saving the New York Times aren't just the subscriptions to the paper, but all this other stuff, cooking and games, it's possible that the style of reporting in and of itself is part of the problem.
Well, here's why I disagree. I think the Post is whatever you want it to be, meaning you can look at it and find really deep, vigorous, in-depth investigative journalism, or you can find, perhaps low-quality horse race coverage, just people yakking about politics, opining with very little knowledge. It's all of the above. I think it's all there, and that way they already have a bundle. That's how I feel about most news outlets. There's the best of the best and the worst of the worst, sort of all in the mix. I sometimes feel like we all live at a garbage dump together, this information garbage dump, and what we're all assigned to do is separate the trash from the treasure. And there's treasure there. There's really great little bits of treasure in the trash, but you have to know the difference.
And we all smell like garbage.
And yes, that's I've never put it that way, but that's exactly the point. And the problem is that we end up all smelling like garbage. We might find the treasure, but there's also so much trash. And I don't want to apply that to the Post. I think the Post is one of the best news outlets in the country.
Agreed.
But I take your point about, this gets to Jay Rosen's line about the stakes, not the odds. In general, in political coverage, there's been so much coverage of the odds that it's turned off an entire generation or maybe two generations to political news coverage. And, one of the reasons why there's so much burnout, so much fatigue about politics right now is because people don't want to hear that, that horse race style coverage as much anymore.
Okay, so then, in the minutes that we have left, let's talk about your idea of getting Jeff Bezos more involved and how that might apply to other papers that are in trouble. Because look, places like the New York Times are rare, right? Like the LA Times has been having trouble. People are having layoffs all over the place.
Yes.
Does your idea of getting the owner more involved, and frankly, Katharine Graham, the storied, legendary publisher of the Washington Post, was deeply involved, but also knew a lot about journalism. So this idea that you have about getting Bezos there to give inspirational speeches, does that apply in other outlets?
I think it can. You mentioned the LA Times, which is a really interesting parallel to this. The LA Times is also owned by a billionaire, Patrick Soon-Shiong. And the LA Times went through a similar roller coaster ride with its owner, where at first, when a billionaire comes along and saves your paper, you think he's saving your paper. There's a real high. It's a very high. But then it follows, eventually with a very low, where people start to realize, okay, he's not going to accept losses forever. He's going to get tired of us. Maybe he's going to get bored of us and sell us. There's a high and a low, a boom and a bust cycle to being owned by a billionaire. And what that indicates to me is that should be only one of many models for how to have sustainable news in the United States. We need successful nonprofit models. We need philanthropy. We need, frankly, I think more government support. We're seeing really interesting experiments in some states now where states are setting aside money for investment in nonprofit news, for local news reporting. I'm really encouraged by that. When it comes to Bezos, here's what I think he should do based on my reporting and based on what's been talked about in the newsroom. He should set up a board of directors, a good old-fashioned board to add oversight. because it is partly about him being physically present and inspiring the staff and telling them what he wants from the Post, not in terms of news coverage, again, but in terms of business and a reinvention of the Post business model. That's important. But what's, I think, even more important is to have big, smart brains around the table talking about the Post, overseeing what's going on with the publisher and CEO, ensuring that they're on the right trajectory, at least on the right path. And I've heard this idea of a board come up many, many times in the past month as I was finishing this piece for The Atlantic. I think that's a really clear way forward, because ultimately this crisis in the news business, this crisis of the Washington Post, a lot of it has to do with something very boring but very important: corporate governance. You need proper corporate governance inside these media companies in order to ensure that the public is being well served.
I mean, I agree with that. I'm going to give you the last word in this conversation, but I will absolutely agree with that. And you remove the corporate, and I think that also applies to
yes.
nonprofit. But I will say that some of the most successful and really scrappy, hard-hitting organizations right now are nonprofit, places like ProPublica and elsewhere that are really doing, The Intercept, doing just incredible work, non-corporate work. And so, again, incredibly biased, but maybe what we need is a little bit more nonprofit and a little bit less corporate.
You know what I've seen in a couple of studies recently that I find very surprising is that many Americans, most Americans, think the local news industry is thriving, when in fact it is withering away, when local news deserts are expanding, when papers are shrinking and shutting down. And yet many Americans think that the local news ecosystem is stronger than it is. Maybe that's because local TV is still holding on relatively strongly. Maybe it's because they have a real affection and affinity for public radio stations. Maybe it's because they find news on Facebook and don't know where it comes from. But we need people to understand the real state of local news and also national news, and that it's not going to be around if you don't get involved and help keep it alive. If you want local news to survive, you have to subscribe. If you want this stuff to thrive, you have to be a part of it. And, honestly, I feel like a preacher sometimes talking about this, because we have to all get that word out however we can, given that there's this disconnect between what people think of the state of the local news environment versus how troubled it really is.
I will say, to end this on a positive...
We just found some common ground.
Exactly. And also on a positive note here, young people are twice as likely to pay for their news, their credible news, than boomers. Younger audience are much more likely to pay for independent news, to donate to independent news, but they don't trust corporate news sources. That's the thing. And young people are much more likely to say that news subscriptions feel like a burden. Yeah.
Bring in those micropayments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, before we go, all this work and research that you put into finding out what's going on at the Washington Post, should people care? I mean, let's say the Washington Post goes under. Will it matter?
I think it matters enormously to have a handful of big, aggressive national news outlets in this country. NPR, the New York Times, the AP, Reuters, NBC, and the Washington Post. Add to that, of course, CNN, ABC, CBS. You need these big outlets with muscle, with institutional resources, with a sense of history, with resources and contacts, and the ability to push governments for answers. Local news is critical, of course. Outlets around the world are valuable. These nonprofit startups are really, really great. But you need these core institutions like the Post that have the history and also a plan for the future, hopefully, to remain in business for generations to come.
I mean, we might as well end it there, because amen, brother. Brian, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Great talking to you. Thanks.
So anytime anybody mentions the name Jeff Bezos, there are a lot of spicy opinions. And I'm willing to bet there are some of you out there who have some thoughts about whether or not Jeff Bezos should get more involved in the Washington Post, or whether he should just keep writing those checks. We want to hear what you think. Also about the state of American journalism. What do you think might be the solution here? And would you be willing to pay for an article at a time? Let us know what's on your mind. It's hearmeout@slate.com. Hear Me Out is a podcast from Slate. The show is produced by Maura Currie. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations, and Alicia Montgomery is the VP of Slate Audio. I am your host, who does not own a $500 million yacht, Celeste Headlee. Until next time, speak your mind, but keep it open.
There was a time when summer surprised us, when galleries opened minds, adventures opened hearts, and we all remained open to whatever the day might offer. It was a time to enjoy. It was summer, this summer, at Biltmore. Plan your visit or overnight stay so you can enjoy the marvelous works of Chihuly and savor the season. Reserve now at Biltmore.com.